and why I like to read genre fiction. I find that you can confront tricky issues, tricky societal issues in genre fiction with an impunity that you're not allowed to if you are writing about the real world in a recognizable way. You
Right.
know,
I think that's an excellent point.
thank you, thank you. I mean, right? I think of writers that I really enjoy, like classic writers like Robert Hunt, who wrote Stranded in Strange Land and Starship Troopers. Both of those books take on social issues, and they do it from the standpoint of, in the case of Stranger, it's this guy Valentine Michael Smith, who's a human, but he was born and raised in a Martian colony. So he has the perspective of a Martian, even though he's human, and that colors the whole his whole views on Earth. It allows Heinlein to criticize certain aspects of human culture that he, I mean, wrote the book in the mid '60s. There was a lot to criticize. Um,
Right, right.
so anyway, I think that's the value in genre fiction. Some people might enjoy writing genre fiction as an escape, but I don't see it that way. I see it as a way to um, confront human issues, confront our real world, but to do it in a way that maybe doesn't make the reader feel confronted. If that makes
Right,
sense.
because to them it's a foreign world, so they're not maybe taking it personally.
Right.
And one thing I have found, I had a very interesting comment on my first book from somebody who does not see the world the same way I do at all. We're polar opposites in how we view this country, this world, this life. And she, of all people, read my book and said, I need to be more like Neil. Now, Neil's the one who probably sees life more like me and completely differently from her. But it kind of was, I mean, I knew, but it was the light bulb going on that when you try and discuss a topic with people, the walls go up. They're like,
Yeah.
I believe this, you believe that. There is no meeting of the minds. But when they're reading a story, it's totally different. I did want to ask about the Holler-Bairnies.
Right.
What are they, and where did you get the story from?
Well, that story is a Appalachian myth of some sort, some origin. I'm not really sure about the academic origin of that. The term itself is Scottish, and
Mhm.
it means children of the Holland. Um, and I was looking for a I was looking for an Appalachian Smoky Mountain myth that would fit with the kind of creature being. Seems mean to call her a creature. She's a being, but the kind of being that Pearl is, and that her species would have been. And I did, so I wanted to root it in something that was recognizable, but I also wanted to tie them in a larger way into all the myths of dwarves and things like that we have folk tales about, implying that maybe her people, the Mountain Walkers, were the origin for perhaps this Scotch-Irish Holler-Bairnie idea, but also for dwarves and that sort of thing. That they were
Mhm.
archetypal. So I made up the Mountain Walker bit, but the Holler-Bairnie word and that sort of part of it came from Appalachian mythology, and actually was a suggestion of a friend of mine, um, whose dad sadly has passed away now, but his dad was big into Appalachian mythology and knew a bit
Mhm.
more about it even than I did. So,
Yeah,
Mr.
I was trying to find more information about Holler-Bairnies, and I could not find anything online at all. And so I didn't know if they typically had another name, because usually I can find anything if I look hard enough. And this, I was turning up nothing. I was turning up definitions of what the hollers are and what a baron is, maybe, but not Holler-Bairnie. So I was kind of
It actually
frustrated with that.
the the clearest explanation of that came orally to me from my friend's father, and he had heard it orally from some relatives, from his grandmother. Um, so that was a case of oral transmission of mythology.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, the second Pearl book, the one I'm currently working on, Pearl of the Shadows, actually has a mythological figure in it, two mythological figures in it that you can actually look up, and I promise you there will be uh, photographic and several textual websites referencing
Mhm.
them. So one of them is Spearfinger. She's a creature of Cherokee Indian mythology origin who lives in the woods, and she keeps one of her fingers sharp because she eats the livers of children. And
Charming.
Well, who wouldn't really?
she's the main villain of the second book, the main adversary of the second book. And then there's a creature called Stone Man, who is supposed to be the arch rival of Spearfinger. So I stuck him in there because I figured my good guys needed some help.
But very disturbing when he thinks maybe these Holler-Bairnies are going to come after him. And yet, in part of this whole chapter, the bigger part of this reading, he's fascinated that he is going to be living next to this cabin that might be haunted. And it comes back to that question about we as humanity, we are very fascinated with these mysterious and strange and dark and unknown things. Why are we so fascinated by this? Why are we drawn to it?
Well, I think that we're fascinated by the unknown. I mean, I think we're naturally curious creatures, we humans. Um, we're fascinated, and we also we want to explore. We want to know, to add to our own knowledge. So, in the sense of the mysteries of our own world, we're drawn to those, the unexplained things, but also going back to our one of the subjects we touched on in the early part of the conversation, why people like horror fiction. One of the things that we're also fascinated by as humans is death and mortality, because we're mortal creatures. So, personally, as a lifelong fan of monsters and horror fiction, I think that we're drawn to horror fiction because it's a safe way to confront our own mortality. Um, and the darker things, um, both in folk tales and in the real world, like, oh, I don't know, creatures that people are scared of, like bats or like snakes or spiders, things like that. We're fascinated by them because we're a little afraid of them at the same time. And to tie it back to the fiction, if you look at the way Matt is sort of fascinated by Pearl when he first sees her, um, because clearly he can tell right away that she's not human. I mean,
Mhm.
he does, and yet she obviously is a child, and that's fascinating too. So, and he's a writer, so his mind goes off in the direction of asking questions about unknown things anyway, like mine does.
Okay.
So, yeah. To come back to your question, though, I think that we're fascinated by the darkness because we're a little afraid of it, and we like to explore things that we're afraid of. We like to explore the unknown. I mean, I think of all the things in human culture and in human civilization that would not be had we not had explorers in our culture who
Right.
set out to explore the unknown.
Mhm.
So many things wouldn't have been discovered if there weren't people who were willing to go into the darkness and explore it. And
I think it's also an explanation. I think it's also an explanation for things as well. I mean, having camped out a lot in the East Coast and around the Appalachian Trail over, my younger years, the idea of the Jersey Devil or Sasquatch, or, when you hear a coyote yipping in the distance at night and it's just you sitting around the campfire and you're hearing wind and branches breaking and you're wondering, is something there, or is it just, a squirrel or whatever?
Yeah.
And you just don't know. And it just haunts you as you're trying to deal with the day-to-day of trying to get your dinner and get to bed. And you hear these awful things and your mind just runs as to what it could possibly be, and
Absolutely.
I think it's just part of making sense of the world to some extent as well, that, well, clearly there's this awful thing that's out there and I'm justified in my belief that it's going to get me, or
and
whatever
I
it might
have to
be.
ask, given that you spend a lot of time researching these things, because I'm assuming you research all of this just like most authors do, do you believe that these things are there?
That's a tricky question. I believe there's probably some reality to some folk tales. Like, I believe there's probably some reason for people to think there's a Bigfoot out there in the woods. Um, I believe that it's statistically improbable that we are the only planet that has intelligent life. I just think most of I'm sure there's extraterrestrial life out there somewhere. The reason why they haven't shown up on our doorstep is probably because they're too smart. Yes, probably a little scared of us. Those people need to get those human beings need to get their stuff together a little bit better.
I can see that.
The embassy down here. But yeah, I think there's probably a reality to the underpinnings of a lot of folk legends. I mean, I'm a religious person. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. And to me, if you can believe in the invisible in terms of the divine, then it's easier to believe in the invisible in terms of the folk tales and urban legends, even though I can't put my finger on those. I can't put my finger on God either, but I have faith in him. And
right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where I come down on this is I can't even say how much I do not want to be the person who says, I think there could be Bigfoot out there, or I think there could be these things. And yet I'm a very logical person, which ironically, I'm possibly the only person who arrives at faith in God by logic, rather than
St.
by
Thomas
faith.
Aquinas did.
Oh, okay.
I got
I'm
that way myself. To me, it makes sense that life didn't start out of nothing. There had to be a creative intelligence behind it. It's too patterned. It's too structured, the way that everything in the cosmos fits together. There had to be a greater intelligence that brought that into being.
What I found interesting about a character like Pearl is, you think so, why talk about things like Holler-Bairnies or, other types of things? And you kind of think of grandmothers kind of trying to keep their grandkids in line, by telling them these myths in order so that they won't, go off the reservation or whatever. And we never personify or anthropomorphize these monsters. They're meant to be kind of awful, right? And and so when you look at Aesop's fables or Grimm's fairy tales or other types of things, these are kind of objectified monsters. What I find interesting about the Pearls of the world is now we're on the other side of the camera. We've broken the fourth wall, in that here's a monster that actually has a personality, who actually has a character, and things like that. We never think about monsters in that way when we're thinking about it as a kid. I'm only supposed to fear the troll under the bridge or whatever it is. I'm not supposed to deal with them as a human, or something like that.
That brings us back to, is it M. Night Shyamalan? Shyamalan. I can never pronounce his name. The Village, or I take it you're familiar with that movie.
Yeah, that's not my favorite movie of his, but anyway, that doesn't matter. Go ahead.
But it just fits in with what he was saying, that these fairy tales and these monsters, in part, they were to make kids behave. You know, the
Mhm.
story of the big bad wolf out in the woods, you got to be careful out there. One of our very early guests, in fact, the second one we ever had when we were still at the radio station, he was from Russia. And he was talking about Russian fairy tales and how they're always very dark. And they have these terrible endings where the children get eaten or, you know, gnawed on or whatever.
Krampus at Christmas or whatever, you know.
Right. But he said there's a reason for that. The world is dark, and it's a way of teaching kids. You need to think about what you're doing. You need to have some wisdom. So, you know, there's that purpose for monsters where you don't want the monsters to be sympathetic. But
No. Well, I think one of the great purposes of horror fiction, whether it's written horror fiction or cinematic horror fiction, it's a safe way for people to confront our own mortality and the things that we're afraid of. Even for children, I've noticed that. I know when I was a kid, I loved monster movies and horror movies, and I was never afraid of them because I understood that movies were imaginary. And I think that as long as a child is raised with a good sense of what's make believe and what isn't, then watching a monster movie is a good way to confront that dark side. And then you can always shut off the DVD player or the television or whatever you're watching the stuff on, and the monster goes away at that point.